Your Family Roots. We're finally back after about 5 months of not being here, and it's good to be back, good to be in the studio, and with me today is Janelle Blue. Janelle is the president of our sponsoring organization, the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society, and today we're going to do part 2 of something we taped earlier, part 1 on vital records, and we talked about vital records in general and also birth records. And today we're going to talk about marriage and death, and something that is not considered a vital record, but I always feel it goes hand in hand with marriage records if you have the misfortune of having divorces in the family. So one of the things that I do want to mention, you'll hear us talk about continual vital records. If you go to the first show, you'll learn more about this. But vital records sometimes started in states and then they would rescind the laws and they would stop keeping them and then they would start up. And continual vital records means the starting date of when they began and they did not stop them. So for example, for my research in New Jersey, it begins May 1st, 1848. For my father's side of the family. For my mother's side of the family in Pennsylvania, it is not until 1906. However, I'm very fortunate because the family was basically in Philadelphia, and the city of Philadelphia started vital records in the 1860s. And so you will find that states or counties may start vital records before the state does. So that said, we're first going to talk about marriage records.
And I have to say that you think, well, okay, I know they were married, I know who the husband and the wife was. Actually, marriage records I have found sometimes will give you clues or information like what their age was at the time that they were married. Sometimes they'll talk about if the woman was of age or if she was not, the name of her father.
Yes.
And so I have found them to really be helpful in putting family groups together.
Marriage records, again, every state was required to set all the requirements for records, and one of them was what was kept. And some states kept more information than others, and we always hope that our ancestors are in a state that kept that additional information.
Well, let's start at the beginning. Were the original colonies, did they log in marriages?
That's the one thing that basically you will find for the original 13 colonies, that they kept marriage records. Now, you may have losses and things because, we're going back before 1776, but for the most part, shortly after, within a couple of years at least, of a colony being formed, they started keeping marriage records. And depending on what colony it is, what they kept in the record, but you're going to get minimal information. You're at least going to get a date they were married, who the couple was, and who married them.
Because in those days, they really cared about that kind of stuff.
Yes.
If you were living together, you better be married.
Well, and in places in Europe, that's why some people came here, because in Europe, things were more restrictive.
Yeah.
You had to be able to prove that you could support a wife and a family. If you couldn't do that, then you couldn't get the license to marry, because they did not want the town or parish or providence or whatever to have to support a wife and kids for them. So.
Well, and the community, if you were marrying someone outside of the community, sometimes they didn't like that either. And they wouldn't give. So you're right. That's where there was a lot of immigration.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the difference between licenses and certificates. Okay. I know when I go to cite a marriage record, I know how important it is to differentiate between a certificate, a return,
Yes.
So.
What we basically had initially was, a couple could go off and go to a minister or the justice of the peace and say we want to get married, and we didn't necessarily have, although during colonial times and early in the history of the states, you had a minimal age that men or women or boys or girls could get married. And there was one of the southern states, I forget which one, where as early as 12 a girl could get married.
Oh my goodness.
And so, you had that, but it was, the responsibility of the minister or the justice of the peace to, make sure that this was going to be a good marriage, that, they weren't marrying someone below the age and all. And of course, they had the responsibility of reporting that information. And actually, if we could have the first slide there, I was very fortunate. My great-grandparents were married in Essex County, New Jersey. And what the justice of the peaces and the ministers did was they took a piece of paper, and I've seen where it's just a corner out of a piece of paper ripped out, and they recorded the information. And then that was sent into the county clerk, and it was recorded on or in the great big ledger type books, and we've got a picture of that. We've switched the slides there. Then that would be recorded, and that would be in that register book, the official record. Well, what I found for my second great-grandparents was the clerk actually got the slip of paper, recorded it in the book, and then he glued the slip of paper from the minister into the book.
I've seen that.
Now, I went through this particular roll of microfilm for the book. It didn't happen for every one, but every dozen pages or so, I would find another slip of paper. So I don't know what caused him to do some and not others. But what I have here is I have the original record from the minister, and then I have the secondary record or
the entry.
The entry, which if there were a difference, I would believe the slip of paper, not what was in the book.
Yes.
But, then they kept the records this way for the most part well into the 1800s. And then, depending on the state, they started issuing a marriage certificate, which is going to usually give you a little more information, again, depending on what the state required. But you're going to often get the name of the couple, or the bride and the groom's names. You may get parents' names. You may get more information about the parents. You'll get where did the marriage actually take place, because often those earlier ones didn't necessarily tell you if it was a minister, what church he was associated with.
Yeah.
I've done a lot of digging into census records is the first place that I go to see if I can find the minister in the census, and then find what church he is associated with. But, oftentimes it didn't give you the location. The justice of the peace, usually you can find lists of where they were.
Well, the ministers were traveling around many times,
and
too.
yes, you did have that with a number of denominations. The Methodist Church that I grew up in began in 1868 with the circuit riding minister from Philadelphia that came into southern New Jersey and rode the circuit. And I think it was the 1880s when they finally got a permanent minister. So you had that, but you'll get, as time marches on, you'll get more information. Does the man marrying, does the woman marrying have an occupation? Of course, how old they were or birth date. Other questions that I have seen is this the first second, third marriage.
Yes.
And I would caution on that one. Don't always believe it to be true, because I have found a number of cases where I saw the first marriage being recorded for one or the other, and I already knew there was a prior husband or wife.
I just did research on a fellow who had been married at least 5 times. And every time he filled that out, there was a different number that he put on which one this was.
Of course, back then they took you at your word. They
Yeah.
didn't, you didn't have to bring in proof of it. And then we get into, and of course this we did have in places. We mentioned, a minimal age for couples to marry, but then you get into really them requiring that they prove it. And so that's when you start getting into licenses, which is permission to actually get married. And you had to go in and you had to prove that you were of legal age. And for the most part, for men, it was 21. For women, it was 18, although that may vary. So again, you want to, and we have an example there of a marriage license and the marriage certificate.
Now, what I've found in Texas, anyway, is that, well, first of all, they've digitized all of the marriage records. Now, every state hasn't done that, but these are all on Ancestry, and they go all the way back into the early 1800s. But later on, what they do is they have the license, and then below the license, they have the return.
Yeah.
And the return is what you really want, because that's the date when it actually happened.
Which was the example. Well, the other thing there is depending on what they did with the license and all, you might get information on one that you don't get on the other. When my grandparents, my mother's parents were married in Philadelphia, my great-grandfather filled out a whole separate form, 2 sides to this long form.
Really? And you have that?
And I have that. I have the original.
Oh, wow.
And, there were a number of questions, and then he had to sign giving his permission, because my grandmother was she was a little past her 17th birthday. She was born in November, and they were married in January. And then there's the actual certificate separate. And I have found the microfilm of those records, and both of those forms were microfilmed. Another place that is helpful for looking for these records, in addition to Ancestry, is FamilySearch.org, because they have gone in and microfilmed lots and lots of records from around the world. And that's where I actually found my grandparents' record. But the license was there. It gave permission for them to marry. And then the minister, justice of the peace, rabbi, whoever married them, then filled out the certificate. And also, depending on what the requirements were, there may be a marriage return, which that was sent into either the county courthouse earlier or the state later to record it. You may get witnesses on that marriage form and a lot of other information. Just a word of caution, just because you find a marriage license being taken out, don't always trust that they got married.
That's right.
You need proof.
That's right.
I grew up the street from a family that the oldest daughter and the boy who lived around the corner from us took out 4 marriage licenses over time. They never got married. They called the marriage off. 6 months after they called it off for the last time, he got married to someone else from town, and she, a couple years later, got married to someone that she didn't even know back when. But there was, one of the things was he was 4 years older than her, but they had dated almost all through high school and her high school and everything. But you need to make sure that you do get that proof that the marriage took place. And this is another point to bring up is because of these requirements, you may find couples snuck off to another location to get married. These are called Gretna Greens, and if you go to Family Search, their wiki, they have quite an interesting booklet in the wiki about Gretna Greens. Gretna Green was actually a place in Scotland where a lot of British went across the border into Scotland to be married because of the restrictions. For us close to here, you had Frederick, Maryland, you had D.C. for Northern Virginia, but also for New Jersey and Eastern Pennsylvania, you had Elkton, Maryland. My father's parents were married in Elkton, Maryland because my grandmother and my grandfather were underage. My mother's sister was married in Elkton because she was only 20 and she needed to be 21 in 1934 when they were married. So they went to Elkton. Other things may cause them to go. Pennsylvania required a blood test in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and I don't know how much after that. But I have 7 cousins that went to a fundamentalist church that did not deal with doctors.
Oh, dear.
And so they wouldn't go get a blood test. So they all went to Elkton to get married. So the marriage records are around. It just depends on what you actually have requirements for in the state to what you're going to find. But they're definitely worth looking for.
And another really valuable certificate then is the death certificate.
Yes.
And when did states begin issuing those?
It depends again on the state. I know in Texas it's the early 1930s.
No, it was 1903.
Well, but they didn't continually, because I had somebody who there was a change around 33 that they had an ancestor that died the year before. And so there's no death certificate.
I didn't say they complied all the time. A lot of counties did their own thing.
Yeah, death certificates actually, the states and the cities didn't care about the people dying. Why death certificates actually started to be issued was they wanted to track communicable diseses. Is there an outbreak of tuberculosis? Is there an outbreak of yellow fever? Today it would be, was there an outbreak of coronavirus that we're dealing with now? So that's what they were really tracking and trying to find out about. And so that's why they started earlier on. And what you will find in those early certificates is kind of very minimal information. You're going to get the person's name, maybe the age, who the doctor was, what they died of, when they died, and probably not a whole lot more. But then as time progressed on, you're going to get more information. You're going to get more information about the death, more information about what they died of. When you get into the late 1800s, the cemetery where they're buried, once funeral homes started to conduct business of burying the dead, the funeral homes, things like that. On to, today you get a lot of information on there, and it just depends on what the state requires. New Jersey, my parents all died between 2003 and 2007, and an uncle. New Jersey requires information on their education level.
Really?
Yes. Did they finish high school? Did they go to college? Did they go
What
to...
does that matter if you're dead?
I don't know, but the state gathers that information. And there's one other state that I've run into when I've talked about this as a lecturer. I had one other person tell me that a state where their family was from also required that. But, it just depends on what the state requires. Other things like, was there an autopsy? There
Yes.
again,
Yes.
it might be that those records might be available, just depending on what the state requires, what you may find is going to be recorded on the
For a
death certificate.
genealogist, getting the names of the parents
Yes.
is really,
Yes.
and now don't take it for granted
granted,
that it's
yes.
correct, but
Yes.
most of the time it,
We have a couple of examples of some death certificates that, if they could show us the first one there. First, I'm forgetting. Again, like we talked about with marriages and births, the deaths were recorded in registers. And this is also one from Scotland, like we had the birth one in the earlier show. And this was confusing because my great-grandfather had an older brother, Hugh, who stayed back in Scotland. And I found his birth record 2 years before my great-grandfather. But then, as I was looking through vital records for Scotland, I found this register for a death of a Hugh Peyton, and it all matched, taking place prior to my great-grandfather's brother being born. That's when I found out about naming patterns in Scotland.
oh,
If a child was named after his grandfather and died young and another son was born. So this is my great-grandfather's first brother, Hugh's register. And then this is a death certificate for my second great-grandfather from New Jersey in 1881. And then I have one. So this is New Jersey comparison to the other one. This is a second great-grandmother who died in 1885 in Philadelphia. Different layouts, different information. So, you're going to have these things that, sometimes you have things that you wish they ask on others because it was so helpful. And so, those are going to vary from one location to another. So again, the more information, and then I think we've got one more death certificate. I think I have my grandfather's. Yes, my grandfather's from Virginia. After my grandmother died, he moved down to Virginia Beach to live with my father's sister, and this is from 1978. So, again, you see there's more information as time moves on these death certificates.
and that one looks more typical of what we see
Yes.
in the modern era.
Yeah, it looks very much like the New Jersey ones, although the New Jersey one, because of questions, is a little longer, but it kind of has very similar border, the seal down in the one corner and things like that. So, it's one of those things that, again, hopefully you can find something. And as you mentioned, be careful when you look at the information. Always look at the informant and see who was the informant and did they really know?
Yeah.
With my two grandfathers, my mother's father, there's a mistake on it. And my mother's brother gave the information. I don't know why he screwed up who my grandfather's father was.
I had the same thing happen.
My father's death certificate, it's my aunt's husband, actually, that gave the information. I can prove everything is correct, right down to not just the county he was born in, but the little town up in Essex County, New Jersey, that he was born in, that I wouldn't have thought anybody in the family would have known unless they got into genealogy. So before we get away, as I mentioned, marriage records are vital record, but divorce records are not. But I always, if I know there is a divorce, I go after those divorce records because they're not considered vital records, but depending on the time period and the state, you can get a great deal of information out of them. You can find information in them that you might have restricted in vital records. For example, if you're not a direct descendant or relative of someone, you may not be able to get birth certificates for
Right.
72, 75, 100
Right.
years. In the divorce records, you're going to get the children's dates of birth, their names. You're going to get when did the couple actually marry if you don't know that. So again, it's going to depend on the time period.
Yeah.
But, all
But you
kinds
can
of
get
information.
those because it's a matter of public
It depends on
record?
what the state is. And, more recent ones, there's actually files. So you'll get all of the paperwork, the filing for the divorce, the summons
reason,
for the other party being divorced, the reason for the divorce, their response, all kinds of things, affidavits, things like that. It depends on the state what the situation is. For example, New Jersey, Virginia, the divorce took place last week and everything's filed in the courthouse. I can walk in and get your divorce file.
Wow.
Florida, the only thing you can get, unless you're a party involved in the divorce, the only thing you can look at is an index which gives you when they were divorced, where they were divorced, the names of the parties.
Yeah.
Las Vegas, wherever, whatever, or Nevada, whatever you want. I've done these. Louisiana, I had a surprise, a great aunt and uncle divorce that nobody in the family, current generations know or knew. I was able to get the divorce file, and there really lots of information in them.
Well, also, this guy that had the 5 marriages, I haven't been able to ever find the divorces for some of those. I assume that he got divorced because the person remarried, but who
Not
knows?
always.
Who knows?
I know of a couple of cases where no, they didn't. They went somewhere else and got married and started all over again. So,
Well, Chuck, thank you again. This has been
You're welcome.
illuminating.
hopefully this will help people with finding new records if they haven't explored them.
And just to let you know that Mount Vernon Genealogical Society is still in business. We're just doing things by Zoom these days. mvgenealogy.org. You're welcome to join us. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, my great aunt and uncle, he died in World War II.
Uh-huh.
And my grandmother and his wife corresponded for years, and my mother's middle sister corresponded with her for years and everything. And I got his military records. Pat Stam actually got them from St. Louis for
Yeah.
me. And so I started looking at them. I had a little bit. He was in the Navy in World War I.